Welcome to Well Warrior Culture, a community of support based on my books, Wellness Warrior Style, Mindfulness for Warriors, the Mindfulness for Warriors Handbook, and the 21-Day Meditation Jumpstart Journal. This is the Well Warrior Show, and I'm your host, Kim Colegrove. I work with society's warriors, protectors, guardians, and healers, and your families to help you rebuild resilience and embrace well-being. If your profession exposes you to trauma and the trauma of others, Well Warrior Culture is for you. You deserve to live, work, and retire healthfully, and I'm glad you're here. And now, on with the show. Hello and welcome to the Well Warrior Show. I'm your host, Kim Colegrove. Today I'm sitting down with Wendy Hummel, and I'm really excited. Wendy is the Health and Wellness Manger for Sedgwick County Sheriff's Office in Wichita, Kansas, and she's a dear, dear friend of mine. And I'm almost too excited to move forward with the show because I just want a girlfriend chitty chat with her for the next hour. But she has a lot of important information to share, so I want to jump right into this episode. I'm going to start by just sharing with you how Wendy and I met because I love the story. In 2017, when I was teaching my very first meditation and mindfulness course to first responders, mostly law enforcement, Wendy was in that class. And that's the first time we ever met. And we chatted a little bit, but I really liked her instantly. Like I felt like she was someone I already knew. I'm sure you've had that experience before. So that's where it started. We got in touch and stayed in touch. The following January in 2018, I taught a Train the Trainer for first responders, meditation and mindfulness, Train the Trainer. And Wendy traveled to Kansas City from where she lives in Wichita and attended that. And we just really have formed a friendship since then. We've worked together. I told her one time when we were together, a few months or maybe a year after we met. And I said, when I met you, you felt like someone that I already knew. And she said she felt the same way. So this is extra special treat for me to sit down with Wendy today. Also, she's an extremely busy person. So we're really lucky that she was able to carve out the time to be with us today. I'm going to let Wendy introduce herself. She has so much to say. She wears so many hats and has so many titles. And I want to give her a little time to introduce herself. And we're really going to focus on Wendy talking about herself today because she's a podcast host. She is the host of the Guns and Yoga podcast. And if you guys haven't listened to that, you need to. And she interviews people all the time. But we, her fans and audience, we don't get to hear about her very often. So that's what we're going to do today. Welcome, Wendy.
Oh, thank you, Kim. It's so great to be here. And the way that we met, I hadn't thought about it too recently, but it really was meant to be. A friendship meant it was.
I agree.
It's truly like we were meant to meet. So
yes, I totally agree. And I love our friendship. And we have a lot of plans for the future. We talk about someday down the road hosting retreats together and things like that, which I know will come to fruition. I feel like I have a celebrity on the show today. So Wendy, will you tell us a little bit about your background, whatever you want to share with us? I love your story of how and why you got into law enforcement, but yeah, tell us about yourself.
all right. Well, before I do that, just to touch upon what you said about how we met, I want to add to that just a little bit more because it kind of leads into my why as to why I started to go down this path of all things first responder wellness. Just like everything else, it really did start with me searching for answers for myself. But the year before I met you, I met Darren Ivey, who's now a retired major from KCMO. He and I connected, and he agreed to come to Wichita, Kansas, where at the time it was before I retired. He came to the police department and to our academy and taught a class called Building Resiliency, Surviving Secondary Trauma. And that was the first time I had ever heard of secondary trauma. No one had ever spoken about this within my career. It's just not something that was in my purview at all. And I remember sitting there listening to Darren's presentation and his vulnerability, the way he shared personal stories about his struggles. And I was like really locked up. Like it really impacted me physiologically because I was kind of triggered by some of the things that he said. I could really relate to them. So that's really for me what really prompted all of this. So that was in 2016. And then Darren and I really, we remained friends. And he's truly, I would say, like my first mentor in this space of first responder mental health and wellness. And when Darren said, Wendy, you need to come here and meet this woman, Kim, who's going to do this presentation about mindfulness, I was like, okay, if Darren said I got to come, I'm coming. And so, it was a 5-hour drive each way from Wichita.
Right. We were in Jefferson City, Missouri.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I got permission from my supervisor at the time to do this while working. But it was more than, it was just one of those things where even if they hadn't given me permission, I was going to take a vacation day and come. Like I knew it was one of those things that I was just like, I got to go. Even, Darren said it, but it just felt like something was telling me I needed to go listen to what this person had to say. And, I tried to get other people to come with me for a road trip, but it just wasn't working out. So I went by myself. And at the time, so this is 2017, my kids were younger. So to get in the car for 10 hours, go to a class for 5 hours, and then come home was a very long day, and, had a lot of arrangements to do at home. But I just knew I had to come. So I just wanted to add that because once I was there, it was truly, I was just really taken back by your vulnerability, your story. I know it was early on when you started to talk about what you've been talking about now for a while. And
I'll just
like,
interject really quickly for anybody who's new, and that would be the loss of my husband to suicide, is in case anyone doesn't know that that's what Wendy is alluding to, and that's what got me into this work. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
no, that's okay. I guess I just assume that the people know that, but yes, exactly. So to hear you speak of that, and then just your passion for really wanting to share the tools of meditation and mindfulness with first responders and their families really, really impacted me. And so we've been friends ever since, as you said.
Oh, I love that story so much.
Yeah,
Uh,
I do.
yeah, and then Darren, you interjected Darren here. So Darren is a friend of both of ours now, and we've all taught together. So he's a Pause First Academy instructor, and you are as well. And you have courses on Pause First Academy on our online platform, and so does Darren. We've all taught together and traveled together, which is really, really fun when that happens. And Darren and I have done some teaching together this year as well. So I say this a lot, but I meet the best humans doing this work, and I've met some dear, dear friends. Yeah, so I forgot about that part of the story. Definitely meant to be. Now let's move into your background and kind of. So I introduced you as a health and wellness manager for a sheriff's office, but that is not at all where your career started. And you alluded a moment ago about retiring. So tell us your trajectory, what led you to law enforcement, what you did for the first 20 years of your career, and then we'll just take it from there.
Okay. So I think where this really starts, if I'm going to think about this, is really when I was young. So I retired in 2019 at the rank of detective after a 21-year career with the Wichita Police Department. But I was one of those people, or I am one of those people who always knew that this was what they wanted to do. And when I was young, I remember very distinctly at the age of 12, it probably happened before that, I knew that I needed to do something. In particular, it was like something first responder. It wasn't necessarily law enforcement, but I knew that I needed to do something to help those who couldn't help themselves. Without, getting too much into detail, I don't mind sharing, but the way that I grew up, some of the experiences in my home made me feel quite helpless and hopeless. And it was really hard to grow up in that environment. And so I think that experience with my childhood, and then just really having this deep calling to want to, give a voice to those who really couldn't do it for themselves. And so I knew, like, from that point on, that I was going to do something. And then it became more and more clear that I wanted to be a cop. I did have a small stint in thinking I wanted to be a prosecutor and go to law school, but that didn't last very long. And I knew, and I really feel like I was able to fulfill my childhood dream, and I was able to get into a career and do exactly what I always wanted to do. I never had these aspirations to be a supervisor or climb the ranks, and become
Mhm.
a supervisor. I knew that I wanted to be a detective, and I wanted to do the work where I got to really help find out what happened, get the facts, get the bad guy, but more importantly is just seek justice. And so I worked a majority of my career in persons crimes. So I was homicide, sex crimes, gang, felony assault, and I loved it. I mean, it was really, really hard work. When I look back now, I'm like, wow, I kind of can't believe how long I did it for. But when I was doing it, I was all in, and I absolutely don't regret any of it. But it did start to take its toll, physically, mentally, and emotionally. And of course, back when I started my career, we didn't talk about any of this stuff. And I would kind of silently sit back and watch coworkers of mine that I cared very deeply for, because when you work in this environment in investigations, really, in any area of law enforcement, but you work with people very closely who are all willing to sacrifice family time and get called in at the drop of a hat. I mean, when bad things happen, we go to work. And so people willing to make that sacrifice, you get really close to people when you're working all night, and you see the best and the worst of them. And I really started to notice that some of the people around me were struggling in very different ways. And I had no idea what to do about it, because I
You
had
noticed
no,
they were struggling like mental and emotional health, stress, and
yeah,
yeah, gotcha.
physically, like people had health problems, but
Yeah.
more what I'm talking about is mental health issues,
Hmm.
substance abuse issues, and just not really knowing that there was something wrong, but having no way, no tools or training to know what to do, and how uncomfortable would that be to bring that up to someone who you're close with. So I started to notice that, but then of course I also started to experience things personally, that, as I now know, they were a result of my lifestyle and the type of work that I was doing, being exposed to trauma very, very often.
And
And
so enter your interest in secondary trauma. When you learned from Darren's class all those years ago that secondary trauma is being exposed to and affected by the trauma of others.
exactly.
Yeah.
Not to mention, I went through my own personal trauma with having kids. Both of my girls were born extremely premature, and during that time, personally, I was also working those types of cases in persons crimes where I was dealing with young children and babies that died, whether they were, at the hand of someone else, or even if it was just a SIDS death, which is a death, like a natural death or unexplained death where they die overnight. It's not necessarily a murder investigation or anything like that, but those things were impacting me, because then I was also experiencing having a child in the NICU, not knowing if she was going to be okay. So there was a lot of things happening for me at that time. And so when I heard Darren's training, I felt it all in my body. And so many examples have now come up as I reflect back. And I'm like, man, it would have been really, really nice to know what I know now back then, because I felt like, I mean, I had to keep it in. And I'll give you an example. So I remember distinctly when I worked in homicide, and my daughter was just about one. She was still kind of sickly because she was a preemie, but she was out of the hospital, home. And we worked a case where we had to go to the ER, which is really common when you work in persons crimes. And it was a young child who wasn't that much older than my daughter at the time. And it was a daycare case where she was left in a car seat, by the person who was in charge of her care, and did not strap her in correctly. And she was crying, so left her off in a room alone, and she got strangled in the car seat. And I'm sorry if I didn't mean to trigger anybody, but I'm just, that was a very difficult experience for me, because I had to go work that case. I had images of my own daughter. It was so hard for me to physically keep it together in that ER and dealing with those parents. Fortunately, at that time, I had a wonderful partner who handled it, and I was able to kind of excuse myself, and I felt myself physically shaking, being
Ah.
sick. I almost feel like I was going to pass out, and I had to really talk myself through this. Like, Wendy, you got to keep your shit together. Sorry if I curse. I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on here, Kim.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So yeah, and there's so many, unfortunately, other examples of times like that
Yeah.
where
I
I just
can,
kept it in.
can I interrupt you just really quickly?
Yeah,
Uh, I so I'm thinking so many things about people who might be listening to this. And so I like to try and pull them in a little bit. I know there are a lot of first responders, mental health professionals, social workers, nurses, others that might listen to this that have a similar experience of you deal with a client or a patient or someone uh, or a citizen and or a critical incident, and it triggers you so much because you have or you have had something similar going on in your own life. So many people over the years have confided in me about that, about some of their more difficult issues. So if anyone's listening and they've had that experience and that kind of they gave them an aha moment, that is very common. It's just that most people don't talk about it because it's hard to talk about. And then feeling physically ill and you admitting like to feeling physically ill. So now over the years, I've talked to a lot of people who have crushing anxiety and have even had panic attacks, but they didn't know it was a panic attack, but something work related, like you're talking about, caused
hmm
them to feel all these symptoms. Some of them have said, I felt like I was going crazy, or I felt like I was losing my mind. I felt like I was having a heart attack, or I might have a stroke, different things like that. So I just like to raise the awareness that because what you're talking about is dealing with a case at work that kind of mirrored or reflected something going on in your own life, that triggering an emotional response inside of you that you didn't realize was happening that made you feel physically sick. And that is very, very common. And we need to start talking about this across these professions. Yeah. So we can support each other. Anyway, go ahead.
exactly. Back
Yeah.
then, this is 2007. So I had no idea when this was happening, what was happening, why it was happening. I just knew, hey, you're a homicide detective. You need to get it together. Plus, I've said this before to you, Kim, but being a woman in law enforcement, I didn't want to show emotion. I wanted to think I wanted others to view me as being professional. So I had to kind of get myself together. And so, that's just one of many different times that's happened. And I, like you now over the years, talk to people all the time who have those very same experiences. But the difference now, which is where I come in now with my current work, which I'll get to in a minute, is normalizing all of that. I don't want other people to have to struggle and suffer in silence the way I did. And so many of my colleagues did, because normalizing these reactions and knowing that there's resources to deal with them, internally where I work and then externally as well with mental health professionals and others in the community who can help with different issues. So I went through my career in persons crimes. There's so many other examples where I experienced something very similar. And then fast forward, I retired and got the opportunity to become the health and wellness manager for a sheriff's office in town. But I'll back up. After Darren's class, I was really, really driven. My focus up to that point had been persons crimes, going all in on being the best detective I could be. I loved going to court. I loved helping victims. I loved all of it. And then something shifted. My passion and my focus shifted to helping those who do that work. So my coworkers, instead of the people in the community, now I wanted to help a different community. And so that's really what I would say kicked off this whole rabbit hole of my interest in first responder wellness. And before I retired, I was able to get a grant from our DA, who is extremely supportive of these issues. And we brought in some train the trainer. I was teaching yoga for first responders, which is a resilience-based training program for first responders. And so doing some of those things, and when I retired and got the opportunity to actually start a wellness program and have a full-time position and the opportunity to do this, it was like a dream come true. Kind of like my childhood dream of being a detective. It came to fruition. And so since that time, I have been in this role full-time with the sheriff's office, and it's been extremely challenging, rewarding. It's like a roller coaster of emotions, because this is definitely something that's needed. But everybody listening, I'm sure you too, Kim, can relate. Whenever you do something new, like introducing mindfulness and meditation to this population, it can be a little bit of a challenge. Not everybody is open to it. So, but what's kept me focused is I know that that people need the resources and the help, and so
Yes, and you developed the health and wellness department of your agency from the ground up. I mean, there was really nothing in place, right?
correct.
Yeah, and
So
you have a course called what is that? What is it on? You have it on Pause First Academy, and I know that you've taught it in webinars and maybe in person. Uh, building a, I can't remember the exact title, but building a health and wellness program from the ground up. You
right,
teach
it's
other
called
people how.
building a wellness program from the ground up,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I did. And what happened, the reason why I even thought to develop a class, a webinar, and now a course that I'll talk about was because people just kept reaching out to me, which is the same thing I did when I was starting this. For years and years and years, I was doing research and I was learning all I could about organizational wellness. How do we help the people that are doing the work organizationally? What's out there? And I would kind of learn what other agencies were doing. Wasn't a whole lot of information out there. And so about 2 years ago, I started to get a lot of inquiries from people about just emails. And I think because of the podcast and because I started to do more with you, Kim, through Pause First, people just started asking, how is it that you started the wellness program? And because I got so many questions, it kind of dawned on me, well, maybe I should put something together to help answer all these questions. Because not that I didn't want to help. It was just becoming so, it was becoming so labor intensive to email people back and call people back, that I thought this would be an easier, more streamlined way to do it. I also needed to put together a capstone class for the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center, because they have a wellness certificate program that I had completed. So that's where this all came from. And then the class has been taught in person now. It's also developed from just a 1 hour webinar class to an 8 hour course that will actually be released like very soon, within the next 2 weeks, on Justice Clearinghouse.
Nice. Okay, for those of you who haven't taken any Justice Clearinghouse courses, go check that out, justiceclearinghouse.com. They do a ton of great educational webinars. And if you sign up and you watch them live, they're free. If you have a membership, you can go back and watch all of their courses. I've taught some on there. You've taught quite a bit. Brenda Dietzman, who we work with, has taught quite a bit on there, and Darren Ivy. Yeah, that's a great resource. I'm just interjecting that so people know they have other
Yeah,
resources for this kind of information. Yeah.
absolutely. And I think it's wonderful that they allow people who aren't members to come free if they come live. And so if anyone's interested in what I just talked about, I think June 11th is my next webinar, and it's called AMA, or Ask Me Anything About Building a Wellness Program from the Ground Up. So people who might be interested in taking the course can learn a little bit about it.
Yeah.
So
Now let's hope Kim gets this edited and out in the world by June 11th. It's the year 2024, by the way. So if I got to get this done and get it out to people so they know they can sign up for that. If it's past June 11th, 2024, then I guess you'll have to get a membership and go back and watch it retroactively. But
there
yeah,
you go.
okay, I'm gonna sign up for that. Didn't you have like 2,000 people signed up for your last webinar or something crazy like that?
Yeah, I think that was what was that? Oh, yeah, that was the one about women's stress, health, and hormones in the
Yeah,
justice
yeah,
workplace. That
yeah.
one was very, very popular.
Crazy. Okay, go on. We're on the edge of our seats.
Well, really, that's what landed me in this position. And so the sheriff, knowing the work that I'd been doing with the police department before I retired, and the sheriff also was a previous boss of mine. He retired from the police department and then ran for sheriff. So he was my boss in the gang unit for many years. So he knew me. He knew kind of my work ethic, how I operate. I like to do a lot of research, have my facts before I roll anything out. So when he learned of what I was doing, and he also started to notice, and this is where I admire leadership who really look out for their people. And he's not the only one, obviously, but he really noticed that people were struggling when there were anniversary dates of deputies that were killed in the line of duty, and then just some other things. And he was really searching for a solution or opportunities to support those that worked there. And so this is how everything kind of got created. When I first started to work at the sheriff's office after I retired, I was teaching resilience classes to recruits. I was teaching yoga for first responders, but my full-time role wasn't wellness for the first 8 or 9 months. I came in doing a completely different job. And then we had conversations about what this could look like full time. And the first initial idea was, well, let's bring in a therapist or a psychologist. And I had, developed a relationship with Pat Hinkle, who's a Kansas City, he's a retired first responder, but a first responder, very well known therapist in our
Yes.
area. And I got to know Pat very well also after being introduced to Darren. And after consulting with him multiple times, trying to figure out the best approach, trying to help the sheriff figure out what to do, Pat and many other people's suggestion was, well, you don't necessarily need it to be a therapist to start out with. You just need the right person to be in a coordinator role and to manage the program. And then you can maybe bring in therapy a different way. And that's what happened, because I am not a therapist. And so the sheriff created the position, and I've been in it since January of 2019. Now, fast forward 4.5 years later, we have a wellness unit, and I am now I am the wellness manager. We have an in-house therapist and a deputy and a 50-person peer support team that I manage collaterally. So a lot has happened from point A to point B that will take about a whole week to explain. So Kim, you tell me where you think I should start, because I think it
Well,
would be.
your whole entire story and your whole entire career are extremely impressive, and that's my favorite part, is that you took your 20 years of experience as a police officer and a detective, and and took that in with you to this new role of really trying to help other people in your profession. It's a beautiful use of a life, by the way, just, taking your life experience and helping other people. I love how you tell the story about switching from working with the community and kind of this new population of, your coworkers and people in this space. Um, so police work, health and wellness, can you touch a little bit? Like, you wear a lot of hats and you kind of have a lot of titles. So I'll let you tick it off, but you're a yoga instructor, a yoga for first responders instructor, you're a certified health coach. Like, go through all of that for us, because it's
Oh boy.
crazy. I don't even know how you handle all of this.
Well, the first thing to know about me is that I'm a lifelong learner. And so I always am challenging myself, and I want to learn new things. But let me just start with this. The thing that's really like the first thing I like to say about myself is that I'm a mother of two amazing, beautiful daughters. I have a wonderful husband. So that's what's most important to me, is my family. But
I can attest to that. I know your whole family, and you guys are one of my favorite families.
yeah, they're everything to me, and I'm very proud of my family. And my husband and I have invested a lot of time, effort, and energy into creating the kind of family that we have. So that's the most important thing. But yes, I have, before I became a law enforcement officer, I got a bachelor's and a master's degree in criminal justice, because I just wanted to learn all things criminal justice before I became a cop. And then towards the end of my career, 2016, I'd been practicing yoga very regularly from the age of 40 on. I'd always been very physically active in different ways. My philosophy on being healthy was getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and going to the gym, hitting it hard, and sort of eating okay, but that was it. And then when I realized that wasn't all that wellness and fitness was, especially as I got a little older, I found yoga, especially after having such a hard time with my pregnancies. So that led me to want to learn more about yoga. And I did become a yoga teacher. And so for anybody who knows anything about yoga, I'm a ERYT 200 500, which means the E means experience, which just means I've taught over 1,000 classes. And the 500 is kind of like the next step. I've gotten 300 hours beyond the initial 200. I like to explain it like sort of like getting a master's degree, but a little bit different. And really what that has led to is me being interested in all the different components or limbs of yoga, because a lot of people just think yoga is stretching, touching your toes, power yoga, gentle yoga. In fact, it's so much more where, I talk a little bit about the philosophy of yoga here and there and how it really, it really pairs nicely with a first responder type of a career. But I started to learn more about those other practices and the other components of yoga. And that's where that 500-hour study came in. And I learned a lot about trauma during that time, because
Yeah.
my yoga instructors and mentors were therapists, oddly enough, that use therapy and somatic practice and mindfulness in their own practice. And then some of them just left it all together and became full-time yoga instructors. So after that, I yoga left me kind of really wanting to learn more, because I had some health struggles myself. And so I started to learn about circadian rhythm science, and the sister science to yoga is called Ayurveda. Most people don't know what that word is. It took me a year to actually know how to say it right, because it's spelled kind of funny. But essentially, that's what it is. It's circadian rhythm science. And it's very simple, but complicated at the same time. And so I wanted to learn more about how to support my own health. And so I dug into Ayurveda, and then I decided to go into a 2-year health coaching program so that I could learn for myself, but that I could also share this information with others. Initially, it was just first responders that I work with, because you would see people coming in, or I'd talk to them, and there'd be some mental health issues or some concerns. But then the rest of the components of their life, like maybe how they were eating, how they were sleeping, how they were moving, or how they weren't moving, interplayed into some of those mental health issues. And it was really just a different perspective into how all of these things are so connected, and how it's important to not just take care of mental health, but also to take care of your physical health, and really understanding the why behind it. And so that's what led me to become a health coach. And, fast forward, at the age of 55 now, Kim knows this, but I have now decided to go back to school again,
I
get
wondered when we were
another
going to get to
master's
that.
degree,
Yes.
and become a mental health counselor. Because as a health coach, as a yoga instructor, like I said, all of these things are so interconnected. And as a coach, you focus on the present, the future, achieving goals, and you're not really getting into people's pasts and trauma, because you're not trained to do that in that capacity. And so for so many years after working with first responders in the way that I have, it's really landed me where I want to be able to help, however is needed. And I do think that a lot of the issues that we bring or that we have, and I know this has played out for me personally, are rooted in our past. And it is important for me to be able to understand how to support people in that. But of course, anytime I learn anything, it helps me tremendously. So there's a little bit of a selfish reason to go back to school too.
Yeah. So I know a lot of people, especially in these populations that we're talking about, the helpers, the
Mhm.
public safety people, first responders, and surrounding professions. There are a lot of people who are, I don't know if the word afraid, but they're hesitant or resistant to talk therapy, or
Mhm.
any therapy. And I've talked to many over the years who have had a bit of a negative opinion of digging into your past, like just leave the past in the past kind of a thing. And so it's really not about just drumming up the past, just like stirring up SHIT. It's about understanding your past so that you can better understand how it might impact your present and your future, how it might inform your choices and decisions in life, and how it might be impacting you as an adult. So it's not just about going back and beating up on your parents or whatever, the reasons why people avoid it. Understanding what happened to you in your past or things you experienced can definitely help you better understand yourself in your present moment. It can help you be a better individual, a better partner, a better friend, a better parent, and then go from here forward healthier mentally and emotionally. So I'm just interjecting that because you're putting together all these different components of your own learning and improving your own health and improving your life overall. And I feel like you're going to be an outstanding therapist for other people because of the path that you've walked. So I'm glad you explained all of that. I'm sure there are people I can't even believe everything you do and everything you've done. It's a lot. I will just say you're not doing this right now. I don't know what you'll end up doing in the future whenever you retire from this job and then go into therapy and whatever you do next. But you did offer a 1-year Ayurvedic health coaching program, which I was lucky enough to take part in, and I learned a lot from that program. And you were focused on primarily women in law enforcement. I got to get in there. There were a couple of others that don't work directly in law enforcement, but putting together all of your knowledge and wisdom and bringing this into a therapy practice is just going to be, so stand by, everybody. We'll see how this goes over the next couple of years. We'll have Wendy back and talk about her future. You're going to be of great help to, I don't know who you'll focus on when you go into therapy. You may not even know yet either, whether it's women or people in first responder professions, but you're going to have a waiting list. Let's just say that you're going to have a long waiting list of clients. Yeah, you're an impressive individual and also just real nice. Just a really very pleasant person. And with all of your history and your background with your job and everything that you've been through, I also know that there was some organizational issues that you went through with your first career, that first mountain, that first career, that that was very painful and difficult. But you're not bitter, you're not resentful, you've worked through all of this. And that is, I think that shines a light, like that's a lighthouse for other people who are struggling mentally, emotionally, physically, in your relationship, with your organization, whatever it is, that change is possible and improvement is possible. And you are kind of a beacon of hope for people. One thing I want to ask you about when you were talking about your pregnancies and your daughters being born prematurely and all of the stress and trauma around that, something that you've said to me a couple of times over the years, and this might be helpful to other women, no matter where they are in their, no matter what age they are, but that you didn't realize until later down the road when you started to study and understand health and wellness, that potentially part of the issue with your problems with your pregnancies was the stress that you had endured in your career and that you obviously were faced with during your pregnancies. Do you want to touch on that just a little bit? Because I know you've learned and you teach a lot about women's health and how those stress hormones can impact your overall health and well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't mind, though, I do want to say one thing that you touched upon about organizational betrayal, about the retirement piece. So when I retired, and I talk about this fairly openly on my podcast, but it took me a while to do it. I retired under circumstances that weren't ideal. I didn't plan to retire when I did originally, and not to say that, you plan things and then things change, But I retired when I turned 50, when I was eligible, but I had always thought I was going to stay 5 years beyond that until about the age I am now. But without getting into too much detail, not because I'm not comfortable sharing it, but for the 2 years or so leading up to my retirement, there was a lot happening in the way I was being treated by the organization and by the people that were in command. And I really kept silent about it for the most part. And it was impacting my mental health, my physical health. And as I look back on it, I ran out and I was so miserable. And my last day at work, I remember having a migraine, not even able to see when I was driving home because it was so stressful for me, because I couldn't believe that, and this is me knowing how over invested I was in this career. So I speak from experience when I know that how we as first responders can really over invest in what we do. But I had given so much, was so dedicated, and felt just so betrayed. And really, it wasn't the organization that betrayed me, it was just a few people. But they were in positions where they really, really impacted my day-to-day life. And when I say words like gaslighting and betrayal, things like that, I don't use lightly. And so it was just a decision at the time, because I was so living in my stress response and my amygdala that I really probably didn't make the decision in the right frame of mind at the time, because I kept it to myself. I didn't reach out for any support other than my husband, and that was the way that I dealt with it. So what I want to say about betrayal is that, I've forgiven the people involved, but I don't excuse the behavior. And I'm not of the opinion that, everything happens for a reason, but you make something out of it when it does happen, right? I'm going to use that experience for me to grow and become better from it.
And
I
to
don't really.
speak about it, to speak out about it so that other people don't feel alone, because you didn't reach out to anybody besides your husband at the time. I mean, it
Right.
was even a long time before you really talked to me about it.
Yeah, it's still
Yeah.
painful to this day, just much easier to talk about. And I'll give you an example. And the reason why you said, well, you didn't say it in these words, but I am not completely over it, because I'll tell you, even just last week, because I work for the sheriff's office, I'm always around first responders and cops and people that work in the jail. That's the people I work with. But the sheriff's office and the police department do the law enforcement memorial ceremony together. We share the memorial. And just sometimes when I see the people that I used to work with that still work there, it can be a little triggering, and it brings up certain things for me. I'm actually really grateful for where I am now, but it does still kind of, it doesn't completely go away, but I can just handle it much better. And the reason I bring it up is because what I have noticed over these past 5+ years is that I'm not the only one who experiences organizational betrayal. In fact,
Whoa.
first responder exposure to trauma and critical incidents is definitely something that we all deal with. But, research studies show, personal experience shows that a lot of times those issues that we deal with are coming from inside the organization. And some of it can be prevented, obviously, like in my case, but sometimes it's perspective and communication. And that's another thing that's important for me to help people with, and also to help the leadership understand too. Sometimes you have to communicate a little bit better with people, and that can make all the difference. It doesn't mean that you're going to change what you have to do, especially if somebody's in trouble or being investigated. But there's a whole spectrum of what that could look like. So I just wanted to speak to it because I retired not in a good way. I often say that I am the poster child for how not to retire. So
Yeah.
I really like to talk to other people about my experience, because I want people to know that they're not alone, and you can retire healthfully, depending on, everybody's situation's a little bit different. But one of the
Well,
things.
okay, before you move into your health, go ahead with what you were going to say. But before we move into the health and the pregnancies, I want to stay here for just a minute, but go ahead. Yeah.
I'll just say this: retirees, because I am one, because all of my friends are either approaching retirement or already are retired, the one thing I will say is that you need to support yourself in ways, if you haven't been doing this already. Meaning, mentally, emotionally, physically, relationships, because you can't wait until afterwards to do those things. But if you're already retired, it's also not too late. And just, and I know, Kim, you talk a lot about retirees as well. But really, that's something that I want to just mention, because I didn't do it. I suffered and struggled unnecessarily for many years after I retired. And quite frankly, so did my husband, for many different reasons when he
Yeah.
retired from law enforcement. So both of us are, he takes the opportunity to talk to people he knows too about this kind of stuff. And I like to think it's because of all the things that we do on our podcast. He's able to really help relay some of this information also to his peers.
Yes, and it's important for those of you who have been through it and came through it to reach back for the others. I'm the worst case scenario of what can happen to an individual who doesn't deal with their problems and issues and mental and emotional health prior to retiring. As a lead up to retiring, a lot of people think I'll be okay when I retire. I can relax then and I won't have this daily stress. But if you haven't done anything over the years, to take care of yourself, speaking of retiring healthfully, sometimes everything catches up with you at one time. And to your point about organizational betrayal, which I'm finding out is very, very common. A lot of people will confide in me that that was a big part of their stress. Also, a lot of people talk about over-identifying with the profession, which you've touched on. And uh, and just the whole, I guess the whole overall issue of being able to retire healthfully. This is something I say in a lot of my presentations and classes, and this is true. When you leave this job, the job goes on the next day as if you never existed. But if you leave this life early because of a health issue, a heart attack at the age of 55 or something like that, your friends and family don't. Your friends and family do not go on as if you never existed. And you talked about how much you gave to your career and how much you gave to the profession, and then how you felt betrayed in the end, and how the treatment of you was not healthy and not fair. And that is way too common. And so I just want to point that out here for anyone who's listening, whether you're going to retire maybe in 5-ish years, or you're right at retirement, or you're already retired, maybe just reflecting and thinking about, maybe you haven't taken great care of your mental and emotional and physical health up till now. Today, start today. I mean, it doesn't matter where you are in your trajectory. Over identifying with the career, that catches a lot of people off guard. They don't realize how much that they've over identified with their title or their career. And then giving so much of your effort and energy and time to the career, the profession, and your agency or organization at the expense of your own life, your own health, your own primary relationships, your own children, significant other, your family. And then you have to sit with that in retirement. And a lot of times people leave and they feel like, I gave so much, and that they just, the job or the organization didn't give back to me in that same way. And that is really, really difficult for a lot of people. It's very prevalent. I think a lot of people just sit in it, kind of suffer in silence, and don't have anyone to talk to about it. So I just wanted to bring that up as kind of an overall, it's really, really common. Thankfully, we talk about it now, though, and there are interventions and mechanisms and ways that you can work through that and help yourself. So that's one issue that people deal with. And another thing is the physical health problems, and it's prevalent among first responders, and how a lot of times the mental and emotional stress and trauma of the job contribute to the physical issues. So I know when I was going through your health coaching program, you talked about looking back and realizing that your stress hormones were probably very high trying to get pregnant, and then while trying to carry the pregnancy to fullness. And so do you mind just touching on that a little bit? What I'm wanting people to understand as they listen to these interviews is how much your mental and emotional health connects to your physical health. We can't separate these out. mental, emotional, physical, it's all your health. Yeah. So if you wouldn't mind talking about that.
Sure. Yeah. And, just to start out with, one of the things that I've learned over the years, and I know you know this, Kim, is that so much of our actions and our behaviors are driven by our subconscious. So, in fact, like 90% of the way that we operate are things that we don't even really know on a conscious level, that are either there from things that happened when we were younger, influenced through our childhood, through the systems we grew up in, our community, our church, and then of course the people that were around. And in learning that, it was really helpful because you talked earlier about learning about your past. That really can unlock some of some of the mysteries of understanding how you operate today. So with that, that really factors into the body being a really good way to kind of tap into how is it that my mental health and my physical health are connected. Well, for me, as I learned that, some of the things that were manifesting for me in my body were maybe a result of some other things. And so let me just say that years after this happened, I started to really learn, as I look back on some of my health issues, why they may have occurred. And it doesn't mean that they wouldn't have happened, but knowing what I know now, it makes me wonder what about this connection. So my husband and I, we're both in law enforcement. We knew we wanted to have kids. It was a personal struggle for me to even get pregnant. And we probably tried to start, I think I was about 34 when we really started to build our family. Had problems getting pregnant and staying pregnant. I had 2 miscarriages, which were extremely painful for me. And as I look back, that's actually probably one of the first times where I really, really personally could have used some support. And besides just talking to my husband, of course, but I was ashamed and embarrassed that I had a miscarriage. It was, I didn't know how to talk about it, and it was hard for me to be happy for other people at that time who were having baby showers, and I see other people go through the very same thing now, and I think it's a little bit different, and I think there's more support out there, but I did it by myself. And so it was very painful. And when I finally got pregnant with my now 18-year-old daughter, I was a wreck. I was so nervous because I also had a scare early on in the pregnancy where I thought I was miscarrying. But then all things pregnancy related did never really went well for me. Throughout my career, I was in persons crime. So here I am getting called out, not sleeping real well, high stress job, go, 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 go. I get pregnant. I slow down a little bit because I physically felt different right away, which I know is some women experience it differently. But then, probably, I think it was around 24 weeks, I started to get what's called preeclampsia. I started smelling protein in my urine, and my kidneys were being impacted. My blood pressure was impacted. I started to retain a lot of water. And so I had to stay home on bed rest and then got hospitalized. And fast forward when my daughter was born, she was born 10 weeks early, so 30 weeks, 5 days. She was 2 pounds, 12 ounces, which was even small for that gestation. She probably should have been about a pound heavier, but because of all the issues I had, it's called intrauterine growth restricted because of my high blood pressure. And so she was in the NICU and for a total, I think, of 55 days before she even came home. And when she came home, she was only 4 pounds. And she also had to have a blood transfusion during that time. There was just a lot. It was very difficult. Not to mention my health was impacted. Having preeclampsia, I mean, people die from preeclampsia. So I had very high blood pressure. I was very sick. I was very weak. Had an emergency C-section during all of that. So there was a lot for me going on. And then, obviously my daughter is healthy now, but it took many years. Her childhood, she got sick a lot. It was not an easy road. And then I was like, I'm done. One, we're lucky. We're not having another. I had always wanted to have two. But my husband, being Mr. Half Glass Full, talked me into it. I'm so glad he did. But the same thing happened with my younger daughter, Autumn. She was born 3.5 years after my first, but the same thing happened like clockwork. My doctor pretty much assured me this isn't going to happen again. Preeclampsia usually
Oh,
doesn't repeat itself. But I knew, and this was the first time that I really like felt deeply that I really was tapping into my intuition. I knew my body was going to do the same thing. I just knew my body was going to respond in the same way. And I can't explain why I knew that, but I did. But I went ahead and, we tried and got pregnant pretty quick. Same thing happened to the T. And even though I'd been down the road before, it still didn't eliminate the worry because there's so many complications that preemies can have. And I was very fortunate because my younger daughter had a less of a stay in the NICU. In fact, she was born lighter, but did much better and came home sooner. But it was not an easy road. And so my job, the stress of the work that I did, I now know played a part in some of that hormonal endocrine disruption. And so fast forward, as you're talking about, Kim, when I learned in my health coaching program, the interplay and interconnection between our nervous system and our endocrine system, in particular for women. Now, there's metabolic flexibility and our emotional system, all of it is connected. But when we're talking specifically about hormones, men have hormonal disruption too, but our systems as women are a little bit more complicated. And for women that are in these first responder professions where we're working overnights, everything is disrupted, and there's added stress from the type of work we're doing. And not to say that there aren't other professions that aren't stressful, but we can all agree that this is a little bit unique and different. And it's not just first responders. I mean, this plays into people who work in the ER, medical professionals. There are,
yeah, nurses and people
yeah,
who do shift work, who
exactly.
work
Right.
odd shifts, and their sleep is disrupted. And yeah, there's a lot of professions that would be included in this kind of hormone disruption
Right.
conversation.
Yeah. And without getting too far into the rabbit hole, what I learned is that when our bodies naturally want to keep us alive. Like that's innate. That's our stress response. And so when our stress response is activated too frequently, like a first responders might be, right? Because of the type of work that we do over and over again, when that's the first go-to that our body will do. And that's those hormones like cortisol, right? Like adrenaline. And when those get depleted, they borrow from our sex hormones, which are estrogen, progesterone, and those start to get depleted. And that's a very, very oversimplification or explanation of this. But some of that was happening to me at this time in my 30s. Like I was into getting called in all the time, high stress, exposure to trauma. I gave you some of the examples, but this is stuff that was happening over and over again. And I can't help but think, how did this impact me at that time trying to start a family? And I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened otherwise, but it makes me look back and try to put the pieces together, knowing what I know now, how important it is to take time to downshift. And I didn't know how to do any of those things to my nervous system. And so,
Yes, I can attest to the fact that you are a go-getter. You're
yeah.
a go-getter, yeah.
And I've had to learn that although, you talk about all the things I do, I don't do them. I haven't done all of those things at the same time. And I absolutely prioritize restorative yoga, meditation, time in nature, time with my family, because I know it's a necessity, something that would have been helpful to know earlier on in my life because of this connection. And I'll tell you that I think the career has also impacted my hormonal disruption in the stage of life I'm in now.
Yeah.
Because, hormonal disruption isn't just, about having kids, right? It starts, when
Yeah.
we're in puberty, then there's the childbearing years, and then there's perimenopause and menopause. And so some women go through that with ease, but for me, it's been a little bit of a struggle. And I think some of that is linked to the way that I've lived my life over the last 25, 30 years. And a lot of what I've learned backs that up too. So that's something I like to share with women too, because I think it's really important to understand this connection between our stress level and our hormones and how that can impact, our metabolic systems and everything else.
Ah, yes, 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 yes. Oh gosh, this is a whole conversation, a whole separate
Mhm.
conversation. I don't want to say too, to any men that are listening, well, we start talking about this, and we're going to move on from now and we're going to wrap up this part. But Wendy and I have agreed that we're going to do a part two because we knew we had a lot we wanted to talk about. But if you're a man listening to this, I mean, just consider what we're talking about and apply it to the women in your life, whether it's your mother, your sister, a best friend, your sibling, your daughter, whatever it is. But it also applies to men too, in terms of stress hormones impacting your overall health. And when I talk to people about this in my classes and presentations, and I talk about the amygdala being hyperactive or activated regularly, which dumps the stress hormones into your system and how that impacts your nervous system. And then a lot of times I will describe it by saying, if this is your experience in a job where your stress response is turned on very regularly and you go to that like high alert a lot, if you aren't taking steps to counteract that, and what I mean by that is breathing, uh, taking part in dialing back or cooling off your own stress response, trying to reduce the overall stress in your life, taking care of your mental, emotional, and physical health to the best of your ability. If you're not doing any of that, if you're just like full steam ahead all the time, then you can go through an entire career sort of marinating in stress hormones. I mean, that is kind of what it's like you're just marinating in stress hormones. And that's only sustainable until it's no longer sustainable. And sometimes that is like a lights out kind of I was fine yesterday and now all of a sudden today I'm in bad shape. But it can build up over 20 years, 25 years. So wherever anyone is in their life or in their career, I just kind of want to hit on that point. Considering your level of stress and what you are not doing to manage or mitigate or reduce that stress, and understanding your own system, your nervous system, and what stress hormones do, they wear down your biological systems, and nobody escapes that. So I'm not trying to be doomsday. I'm trying to encourage people to just some self-reflection, right? Some self-reflection, self-awareness, turn to your own inner world, your mental, emotional health and your physical health, and just start to consider some of this, because there are so many health improvements that are simple, baby steps, interventions that can help hugely. And I interviewed Jamie Waymeyer, who is the clinical director of the Battle Within. It's a program that you and I are both very familiar with. And she has a quote in my book, Wellness Warrior Style. And she says something like, stop waiting 20 or 30 years into someone's career before you address wellness and resilience training. Unfortunately, for people our age, that's exactly what happened, because 20 years ago, nobody was talking about health and wellness, in these professions, but we are now. And there are a lot of outlets and places people can go, even on their own, if their agency or organization doesn't have a fully well-developed wellness department. You guys can go out on your own and look into some of this. One thing I didn't mention in the beginning that I want to mention now is that you were in my first book, Mindfulness for Warriors. You were one of the first 9 first responders and veterans that I interviewed for that book. And you shared, some of your story in that book. And a lot has happened since then. So I know that we should begin our wrap up here, because I want to respect your time. You're a very busy person. And can we agree, pinky promise, that we'll do a part 2 to this?
Of course. Yep.
Okay, we will do a part 2 down the road. And I'd like to talk some more about what you're doing now, and some of the instruction and the peer support work, and some of the things that you do now that we didn't have time to touch on today. But I've loved speaking with you. I'm a fan. I want to remind everybody, if you haven't listened or you're not listening to the Guns and Yoga podcast, let's see. Police One magazine, Police One Online, named it one of the top 10 best podcasts for first responders in 2022. Is that right?
I think that's correct.
Top
Yes.
6 or top 10
It was
best
top
podcasts?
10 a couple of
Top,
years ago.
yeah,
I
a couple of
haven't
years
seen
ago.
a recent list, so I don't know.
Yeah, and I know you're not doing regular episodes now because you just have a lot going on, but I know that you'll keep the show alive, right?
Yeah, I still put out
Continue.
an episode probably about every month because
Yeah,
I so enjoy doing it. It's fun for me. I learn a lot, and a lot of times too, it helps me in my full-time role. I always reach out to people who I think it's going to be valuable for people listening, but oftentimes it's because I just want to learn more about what they're doing so
yeah.
that I can help support the people that I work directly with too.
We all benefit from that. When you dig in and do the research, we all benefit from that. And I found out when we signed on before we turned on the recording that I'm the only person that you've interviewed twice for the Guns and Yoga
Yes.
podcast. That's crazy. I was your first ever guest.
You were my first, and like you said, only other person to return. I do have a couple others that I want to invite back, just hasn't happened yet. So yes, you hold that very special title right now, Kim.
I'm honored. I really am. All right, Wendy. Well, I have enjoyed my time with you immensely today. Thank you for sharing. And we will schedule this part 2 in the next, month or 2, maybe, so we can pick up this conversation. Thank you very much for your time. Any parting words before we say goodbye?
The only thing I want to say is that with everything that we talked about, the importance of nervous system regulation, and I know there's different ways to do that, but just to the work that you do, Kim, teaching and facilitating mindfulness and meditation for first responders, really anybody, is such a valuable resource that I just want to emphasize that to the people that are listening. I know those that listen are a fan of you already. But there's a lot of different ways to go about it. But really, the work you're doing is so important. And I am very happy to be your friend and to also work alongside you. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you for that. And right back at you, friend. Yeah, that is the foundation of my message to people that I work with is meditation and mindfulness used to be, an eye roll and still an eye roll in across these professions for some people. But what we're really teaching is how you can use your breath and some uh, self-reflection and inner reflection, like I've talked about earlier, some self-awareness, how you can use these things independently, individually to regulate your own nervous system. Self-regulation is a very important component of meditation and mindfulness. So for anyone who thinks they're weirdo, hippy dippy, new agey, anything like that, I would just implore you to kind of set aside any preconceptions you have and understand that you have the power to begin regulating your own nervous system. It's like a superpower. And that can really be the beginning of improving your overall health and wellness.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I mean,
Absolutely.
like when you teach yoga for first responders, it's a very warrior-like approach to it. It's not like Lululemon leggings and incense and froofy. And that kind of yoga is fun too. But that approach is great for this demographic. And it's the same thing with most of us who offer breathing, meditation, mindfulness, at least within the Pause First Academy community. We do a very straightforward, plain language, kind of mainstream approach. We know how to work with our audience. And
Right. We're culturally competent, it's non secular. And I think if I just end with this story, this might put it into perspective. If anybody who's listening is a little skeptical, you and I have taught hundreds of people to this point now. So we've seen how it impacts them because doing it is really how you understand how it works. Sometimes it's hard to just tell people about it, they have to experience it. But about a year ago, I ran into an officer from a different agency who had come to about 6 classes that I taught. And the most important thing that I try to get across during the classes, of course, our breath work, the direct access to our nervous system. He had been in an officer involved shooting. And he said, the first thing he said to me, it gives me chills when I relay this story, is your breathing saved me. Like that's his exact words. He remembered 3-part breathing. He was involved in this situation as it was going down. He attributed what he learned in the class to being able to get, excuse me, get him through the incident the way that he got through it. So this isn't something, I mean, there's a lot of different benefits to this stuff, but it really, I believe it can save your life in different ways and help you perform better also.
Yes. Oh, that's a key component. I heard you say that many years ago, when we were in some kind of a class together, and you taught just a very short little, yeah, I think it was Darren was teaching a class or something. You taught just a little bit of yoga, and I remember you talking about that too, performance enhancement and how to like tactically,
Mhm.
practically use the skills that you learned from yoga and breathing techniques on the job. So yeah, many facets, helpful facets for people. Yeah, all right. Well, it's a pleasure speaking to you. Side note, we get to hang out on a personal level tomorrow. I'm really excited to see you and just have some girlfriend time. It's been a while, but I appreciate you. Thank you for being here. I look forward to part two, and take good care, Wendy.
Thanks, Kim.
Bye-bye.